Welcome to the Sustainability Motion podcast, brought to you by 84S. We focus on the fast-moving sustainability world to help the business community better understand the sustainability and environmental challenges we face. I'm Matt Moscardi, Chief Content Officer at 84S.
And I'm Noor Al-Saadi, CEO and founder of Canada Advisors and Chief Advisor to 84S.
We have as our guest today, Matt Moscardi. I think it's safe to say that Matt is our only guest who was in a band that played at the legendary CBGB's in New York, the place where the Police, the Talking Heads, Blondie, and many other legends, Matt maybe not included, played. After that, Matt was part of the MSCI team that pioneered ESG scores and ratings. Now Matt's the founder of Free Float Analytics, which is where Matt and his team use data to get behind the real relationships and ultimately the power within corporate board dynamics. They've been called the money ball for boards and directors. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I think we need to have a whole different podcast on the
Lower East Side, back in the day.
In the early 90s, but that's a different podcast.
If I'm honest, we played CB's like a year before it closed.
Yeah, I remember that.
So I'm pretty sure that they were like, if this is the caliber of people that we're getting now, we should probably shut this thing down.
That makes sense. That makes sense to me. All right, well, let's get into what Free Float does. You guys dig deeper on board relationships and influence than a lot of other data providers. You guys are pretty unique in what you do. Can you give us a little taste of what that is and what you find that other folks don't find on what's going on with the relationships with boards?
Yeah, so I don't think anybody actually pays that close attention to boards at all. We've been told by the institutions themselves, this is a verbatim, we don't care about who's on our boards. And those are like fiduciaries telling us that. So there is a lot of disinterest in boards. The average election for directors is 96% in favor of whoever's nominated. So the kinds of things that we built a way, what we perceived as a gap was an understanding in how individual directors performed. So the first thing we built was, how do we understand an individual's contribution to a board? And we just levered sports analytics for that, which we know everything about what athletes do. We know like their favorite, shoelaces and their favorite hot dog joints. And we kind of know nothing about boards in many ways. So we applied the principles of sports analytics to corporate boards and came up with a way to effectively say who's got the most responsibility on any given board in any given spot in time. And then we can apply that. One of the elements of which is how they know each other, the relationships on the boards, like where they're connected to one another. And then we can apply that to sort of performance. We can say like, well, if you own 10%, say, of the responsibility on a board, then you get 10% of the outcomes of the company. And we don't care what the outcomes are. We let investors choose them themselves. Maybe it's TSR, maybe it's CEO pay, whatever it is. But it's all, so the things that we end up finding out is who actually outperforms and a little bit how they get there, because we end up finding connections between them, between other boards and relationships they may have. So the questions we sort of help answer is, how did you get here? How connected are you? And how are you doing once you're here?
Yeah. That's good.
That's the backdrop.
So Matt, I love your focus on corporate boards. And the reason for that is I used to be an activist investor in another lifetime, and I've dealt with a lot of boards which I felt were frankly incompetent, and a lot of these people who were in these board, I had no idea how they came to be there, were allowed to kind of oversee the destruction of shareholder value, and a lot of the battles I led. But that's another discussion. But staying within that concept of, staying within the board dynamics, and you really be uniquely positioned to kind of take us through a journey through this, as we explore this topic. I read through your LinkedIn content, which, by the way, I recommend to anybody here listening to reads Matt's content on LinkedIn. A lot of great ideas. And one of the things you've written about is the CEO deep state. And you talk about the fact that nomination committees favor contacts within their own networks. They don't really go there and find the best person for the job. If we want to talk about meritocracy, they don't do that. So can you elaborate on this a little bit more?
Yeah. So first of all, the idea of the meritocracy is sort of laughable, right? Like when you say meritocracy, I say, how is that measured? And no one has an answer for how it gets measured. So with that as our starting point, so we actually, so the data we have is we started off with just board interlocks across 220,000 directors, global companies. We mapped the whole sort of network system. And we wanted to know, all right, well, who sits on a board with somebody else and who has friends in common? Like if that'll be the size of your network. What we added recently was, and what you find when you see that is nom chairs, nom committees tend to be more interconnected on other boards, particularly on like professional boards, large cap US, Europe companies. These are professional board members who go from board to board. They tend to know each other as a result. We added data to that because we realized there was a giant dark hole in our data, which was nonprofits. And we added over 4 million nonprofits in the US over a 5-year span. Every person on those boards, we're talking about, millions of names, cleaned up all the data. It took us 6 months. And we used every possible tool we could. And then we were really conservative about who a person would be, like eliminating common names like John Smith. So we ended up with a small cohort of people that we could absolutely identify as on a board at a time with another board member at a time. What we ended up finding, why I called it the CEO deep state, is on average, a CEO is connected, and this is an average, right, to like 1% of their board. It was generally large cap CEOs are connected to maybe one person through another board if they're on other boards. But for the most part, CEOs weren't the most connected. It was nom chairs or sometimes chairs of the board. When we added nonprofits, the number went up to 15%, as in almost every single CEO on a publicly traded U.S. board was connected to someone else on that board, and that actually outpaced even the nom committees. It was the CEOs and chairs, often because they're combined as CEO chairs in the U.S. So what we end up seeing is there is effectively a sort of pipeline, a succession pipeline for boards that has nothing to do with merit. It has everything to do with connections you have. Now, this we sort of anecdotally know, but we started with the data and we actually took it to some board placement agents or ex-board placement agents who could talk about it. And the feedback we got was, A, this is absolutely how it happens. And B, it's worse than you think. Because what happens is the CEO and the chair or the nom chair, they pick a list of people, a short list, and that's not a list for this year. That's a next person up list. As in, they've set up succession based on who they know. Like, oh, I'm on the board of such and such with Frank. We'd love to have him on the board. And then year after that, Jim and I are on this other board. I told Jim he could join us like in 2 years. It is actually preset. There is no measurement. It has nothing to do with performance, has nothing to do with knowledge. Our data suggests that only 30% of US directors have core knowledge of the industries in which they're sitting on the board. It's not about that. It has to do with, do you know the management team?
Yeah, I remember I'm on the Free Float Analytics mailing list. And I remember getting something last week, some of the research you guys are doing that showed just how, I'm going to use the word uninformed people are about a lot of the topics they're supposed to be informed about on boards. And that stuff about nonprofits is interesting. I guess I should have suspected that, but when you said that 15% number, I was waiting to see what the number was you're going to give us. I thought it was going to be higher because, back in the day when we were both reading too many proxy statements, digging through all this information to see, how Jane is connected to Jim on these corporate boards, it was only corporate boards we were looking at. And we couldn't get to the connections, all the other social connections and cultural connections those people had. And yeah, that makes perfect sense. And so think about it. All these people who have been looking at this director data for the past 30 years didn't have most of the data.
I mean, that 15% is the average
right.
across caps, right?
Right.
The higher the cap you go, the worse it gets.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the places I'm talking about are like I thought in my mind when I started this, I thought, oh, you know what? I'm going to see like the Business Roundtable board, for instance, is just CEOs of major mega cap and large cap companies who, you know, there's 20 of them. This is going to be a major connection point. And it was, but I was not prepared for the major connections points being like the National Association of Manufacturers of the US, or the Partnership for New York City, or Business Leaders for Michigan, right? Like there are these, the YMCA of Los Angeles. These are places that, I mean, you know, the YMCA people just go to, and you don't think of the board of the YMCA for Los Angeles as a breeding ground for connections between large cap executives, but they absolutely are. We actually started tagging the nonprofits who are lobbying, who are registered lobbyists or who have lobbied in the past year. And one of the things that's become interesting is which of these directors are not only cultivating sort of succession on their boards through these nonprofits potentially, but they're also using the nonprofits and their connections on the nonprofits to influence policy. It becomes a very large web of sort of interconnected self-interests that we're starting to map.
Oh, that's interesting. All right, well, we could talk about this forever, but I want to move a little bit on to, since we're all pretty old heads in sustainability on this call, we've been in the trenches for a long time. And, you know, we talked about your time at MSCI and sustainability reporting. I want to ask, what changes do you think are most urgently needed around sustainability reporting? We saw, you know, what was going on with the CSRD in Europe the last couple of months, you know, and, you know, what's the pullback in, you know, sustainability reporting that we expect here in the States, you know, not just frameworks, but in the mindsets and skills of those in the trenches currently in sustainability. What are your thoughts about sustainability reporting, where it is, and if you're in charge, what would you be focusing on? We're not recommending we put you in charge, but if you were in charge,
no, you should not.
What I mean, just as someone who's been doing this a while, what do you see is effective and not around sustainability reporting? What should we be focusing on?
I mean, look, I have to out myself as I'm not a standards guy, as in not that I don't understand the need for standards or why, you know, their standards are going to get regulated in Europe in particular. But I don't find as much value in them as I do understanding what a company puts out on their own. The fact that it's voluntary tells me a lot. In fact, the fact that companies are pulling back. So we did a study for a client of ours who asked us to look at companies who are pulling back on DEI reporting as a result. This is before the recent administration actually took office. So this preceded that, but they said DEI reporting flip, right? Can you tell us anything about the boards that are okaying that? And what we ended up finding is every board that basically backtracked on a DEI reporting target or reporting at all, they were twice as likely to restate their financials and 4 times as likely to restate or drop a carbon target. That tells you something incredibly behavioral about these people. What they're choosing to tell you in a report, not beyond, because it's not mandated. Their willingness to sort of change as the time changes, to alter their methodology of reporting, to remove reporting entirely. I used to, when I was at MSCI, and I worked with analysts all the time, would train incoming analysts. I used to tell them all the time, if there's a picture on the cover of the sustainability report of multiracial kids holding hands on a beach, that report's not for you. They're not talking to you, right? They're talking to some other stakeholder, and it's not really about the data. We on our podcast, Business Pants, in the early days, we did a joke where we looked at every company's reported diversity statistics, and we cataloged in their sustainability reports or on their website the pictures of people of color as a percentage of all the people in those reports. And we found that like Johnson & Johnson, 80% of the people on their website or the reports were people of color, and 80% of their team was white, right? Those are interesting statistics because it tells you something culturally that's very real, behaviorally that's very real about the companies. So when it comes to reporting, anybody who's in a position to report something, I think the lesson is the things that you don't say are as important as the things that you say for an actual analyst. it's important to do the real work and say, what matters to this company? Because I am effectively not just communicating a data point that some ESG provider is going to snap up and then chuck into a rating. You're providing the market with information about the way your company thinks, what it values, and how, if this, you value this now and you don't value it later, how the market can interpret that as this is a fickle company that will just change with the wind, and it's all about the short term. Because you can really separate the Costco's who double down on DEI or someone who's doubled down on carbon and versus somebody who is backtracking or flipping or not caring. That there's a long-term view and a short-term view there.
That's interesting you say that, and just emphasize that point, reemphasize that point, is, especially over the last 10 years ago or so, we've seen so much training on ESG and sustainability. CFA had their own thing, GARP had their own thing. There's all these different training, and that's what E4S does. But something that we try to make sure people understand is you have to understand the story the company's telling. You're not going to get that in an MSCI rating, this number versus that number, even if you have the data below that. That can tell you something. But you have to be a bit of a detective and a bit of a storyteller to understand what stories are they telling, what does it mean? And that kind of information of just stepping back from an initiative or doubling down on an initiative. There was, we're recording this the first week of April. This will probably come out the second week of April. But I remember late last week, there was a story put out by Morgan Stanley about all the banks stepping back from, reporting and net zero. And it's the same kind of signal, There was no big press release. There was no, Jamie Dimon didn't stand on stage and announce something. But that tells a story about what those companies are doing and their priorities are. And you can look at, I think, Carbon Tracker, I'd have to look it up, but someone puts out a report on, how much these banks finance oil and gas, and the trend of that. It was up during the first Trump administration. Now then it went down, and it'll probably go up again. So understanding those parts of the story that are voluntary and aren't, if you look just in the metrics, you're going to get the same results as every other analyst. You have to be a little bit of a detective.
I mean, it's worth saying the metrics obviously have value and the change in the metrics matter. But to me, the story was always like the metrics that you aren't looking at anyway. Like when I was at MSCI, so I started off like a 10-year career by looking like basically hand collecting data from banks. And one of the first things that we ended up collecting, because I was curious about it, was not like, just who do you lend money to and how much do you lend, and so the data that we could get, but it was, where does the sustainability team sit? Is it under marketing? Is it under risk? Is that under do you just say we report to the CEO, which is fake, right? Like there's not, it's unlikely that like some junior sustainability team reports directly to the CEO or report to the board. We would look at that because, to your point about narrative, right? That's where the narrative is. The narrative is a combination of all of these data points that you're putting out that are going to be regulatory mandated or not. The ones that you're not putting out that you don't deem important enough to put out, and the data points that don't get collected but you are giving out without knowing it, which is who reports to who and how is this governed. That tells you a lot about the behavior of a company and a lot of things you don't mean to communicate in many cases. So the advice is like, be intentional, know what you're communicating and mean to communicate it, and check to make sure that you're not communicating something you don't mean. Because if you're putting out something that you don't mean, that you have to flip on later, there are people like us jerks at Free Float Analytics who are writing it down and making jokes about you on our podcasts.
We could continue with this conversation, but now I want to take you back actually to the nomination of corporate directors, because I think that's an important discussion. Now, I mean, we all agree here that, boards of directors have incredible responsibility toward shareholders, potentially a broader set of stakeholders. So there is an important role that the board plays in the life of a company, in the future of a company. But what strikes me, and I would love to get your thought as to why there's just so much apathy from the shareholder side. Why don't they care about who these people are, what their performance is. I mean, these are the guardians of their wealth, in a sense. That should be the most important decision that you have an agency over as a shareholder, is actually voting for somebody to represent your interests. So I just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, it's something I wrestle with. We actually just recorded an interview for our other podcast, Proxy Countdown, with law professor Sarah Hahn out of Washington and Lee. Her work is basically around this idea, around rational apathy is the term for it. Like, why? It's basically the belief system that there's no economic, upside to exercising your right as a fiduciary to vote. And therefore it makes economic sense to be apathetic. But she also, she sort of aligns that in some ways with the rise in authoritarian rule globally in political systems actually has some roots in corporate systems where that apathy exists, because as business leaders increasingly leave the business democracy and go to the political democracy, they're porting over sort of the same tactics. So when you see Musk's utter disdain for sort of the business democracy by hand choosing his directors and all that kind of stuff, he ports that same thing over into the political democracy to the extent that he's there now. But to your point, I think there's a long history of economic research viewing stewardship as a cost center, not as, the focus entirely on alpha. And I know this gets to, like sustainability as a theme, because the focus on alpha is generally short term and is generally like, it can be destructive from a sustainability point of view if you're trading short term alpha for long term sustainability. That notwithstanding, I think there's an economic mindset that if it doesn't generate alpha, if I can't measure generated alpha, why do I care about it? And it's a cost center. There is sort of like a whole, plethora of research around it makes sense that you wouldn't care about this. Meanwhile, you don't have Enron, you don't have Volkswagen, you don't have Boeing, you don't have major blowups that basically cost companies billions or an aggregate trillions of dollars over years without the board acting as guardrails. The problem we have is we try to prove the negative. I get asked all the time, prove to me that your board analytics will generate me alpha. And I say, if you're asking me that question, you're asking me the wrong question. Prove to me that like the board hasn't stopped you from losing more money. And you can't do that either. Like when you flip these questions on their head, which is not what you're trained to do. You're trained to look at the market as sort of a system that is incredibly efficient at pricing everything, but it prices people really badly. It prices human decision-making really badly. And the fact is, when it comes to directors and nom committees and the process by which directors are chosen, the indifference that investors have to those directors, it misses the forest for the trees. Those are the people, if you want to know why we're not going to hit a carbon target, that's not a question for a company or an investor. That's a question about who's in charge setting the carbon target and whose job it is to meet the carbon target. That's a human question, not an asset question. So I think the apathy exists because it's basically 100 years of sort of cultivated apathy. But I think now that the data increasingly exists to look at the human beings and their role in decision-making and the power and responsibility they have, I think that it's time to sort of flip that question over and say, is it still rational to be apathetic?
Well, let's just take humans out of it and make all AI directors. How about that?
There's already a board that tried to do it. There's a board right now that has,
I thought I was making a joke.
No, they literally are trying to add an official director that is AI. It's like some small cap board. It's kind of a stunt. So it kind of is still a joke. But even the AI, when you're talking about AI, like our questions are exactly the same. Like, what was this trained on? Who was this trained on? Because you're feeding it some content to train a system. And my question is always who? Because that's what you're going to get. That's what it's going to spit back out.
Well, ED4S, is an organization that does sustainability training. That's what we're all about. So as someone who's been at this a while and seen good training and bad, where would you direct people as far as sustainability training, what to focus on and what to not worry as much about? And where do you want training to go in the future? I mean, we've talked about people focusing on, not enough of the right things and not understanding the whole story. Where would you, again, you're given all the power. Where would you focus that training?
God, it's so dangerous to give me any power.
Well, this is just theoretical. Outside this virtual room, you have no power.
Then I quit. Look, if you're an investor, there's basically the two cohorts, right? If you're a company or you're an investor, and when you're thinking about sustainability training, I think the sustainability space has largely been distilled down to there's a whole bunch of data. We're waiting for somebody to tell you what's material or not through regulation. I think number one, make the call. If you're a company or an investor, it's your call to make what's material. That's actually definitionally the rule, right? It's up to you to decide what's material. That's like the regular person rule or whatever. Reasonable investor rule. We have all this data and we've been waiting for what's material, what's not material, whatever. Make a call, and it's not invest, divest. It's invest, divest, vote, right? You have a vote at a lot of your assets. Now, it may not be true of bonds, or it may not be true in a private company. There's going to be limitations to that, obviously. But for the most part, we've left out an entire piece of the equation, which is voting. And I think from a training standpoint, you need to know your people weaknesses, because no matter what you think is material, one company or another company, the people have to make decisions about A, what they think is material, B, how they're going to deal with it, and C, whether or not it's actually accomplishable or they're incentivized to deal with that thing. I don't think we ask that nearly enough about when it comes to sustainability. Who is setting this? And I in my undergraduate training, which is the maximum amount of training I was able to achieve in my lifetime. In my undergraduate training, we were taught it's all about context. You're reading a book. It's not just what the book says. You should understand the author, the person who said it, because that actually gives you a lot of context for what the meaning of the book could be. And I don't think it's different here. So if you're training, I want to know how people affect the outcomes of sustainability, how decisions get made. What's the real process by which decisions get made? Who made it? Did you make it 5 or 10 years ago? Did we put something in place that's durable? Because sustainability isn't a question for now. The average director sits on a board for 7 years, and that's not the time in which we're going to achieve a lot of the issues of sustainability we're talking about. Is it a durable solution? So I guess my magic wand wish for training would be, I want to understand. My partner Damien on the podcast says all the time, he wishes that every director, everybody at a company would have to do 10 minutes of stand up every year as part of their formal assessment. And he says that because there's no better way to understand what a person's thinking, how they act, than putting them on stage in the least comfortable position they could possibly be in, making jokes, right? I seriously, when I think about training around sustainability, I think you need to fuse like the data and the governing structures and all the stuff that we're very familiar with people and their abilities, their limitations, their inherent biases in executing those things, and creating accountability structures for those people that last, that are durable.
Yeah, the question is, besides, of course, the work that Free Float is doing, how do we do that?
I mean, I don't care about anybody else. I just care about myself. So, yeah.
Well, Matt, you mentioned something interesting. You mentioned, maybe debt holders, don't have the same vote. But I think something equity investors forget, and that ties back to your kind of advisor on voting. Debt holders have covenants. That's how they control whoever they lend money to. I think shareholders forget that they are the covenant by voting. They don't exercise that covenant. And I think, to your point in terms of training, people have to understand that they have agency and understand how they should exercise, how can they exercise that agency to fulfill whatever task or obligation or goal they'd like to achieve. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point to make. It's we often talk about technical training, but I think you're talking about something deeper around people and their awareness of their choices.
I mean, the reality is, I'm going to back in the day myself right now, but back in the day, we weren't, I can speak for MSCI and my experiences. The people I was surrounded with were not like economics trained, Wall Streeters. They were a weird mix of, like there were some like activists or environmentally, focused people, but they were like artists and like, like they were outside the box thinkers is mostly what they were. And I have hired a lot of analysts in my time, and I've talked to a lot of companies. And the thing that I always tell them is not necessarily the work, to the point of ED4S, right? You could take a training class and get a lot of the content knowledge that is required, but you can't, it's really hard to create somebody who's inquisitive, to understand and measure whether or not you have like a long-term drive to make change, or you're a change maker, or you're persuasive. Those things are hard. And those are the things that when you're doing like trainings, imparting on somebody, like the technical stuff you can learn over time, but you have to execute it. And you're going to have to navigate the politics of your organization, whatever organization it is. You're going to have to understand the levers and power that you have. You have to learn how to persuade and write and engage. And if you're an investor, to your point on covenants, you have to understand your power, your role, and your duty. You have a fiduciary duty that we've largely abdicated. All of those things are important to know. Now I'm philosophizing. I'm basically like a Greek philosopher.
No, I think that's a great way to put it. I think being curious about what you're analyzing or what you're looking at, exercising critical thinking. Always don't just accept the answer you're given. Understand the context, like you said. You have to understand what the author was thinking, what they were going through. Just reading A Tale of Two Cities is one thing, but understands where Dickens was coming from at the time and the shape of the world then tells you so much more. So that's great. Yeah, it's good to end on a little philosophizing. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, thanks for joining us, Matt, and thanks for everyone listening joining us today. If anyone's interested in reaching out, as Noah said, you can find and bother Matt on LinkedIn, as you can the rest of us. And if you're interested in ED4S, you can find us at ed4s.org. Take care, everybody.